Hi, I'm Mark, this is Mark's Tech Vlogs on YouTube, and today I'm going to bring you guys a review of the Pioneer SPH-DA130DAB Apple CarPlay stereo. Now, because that name is so catchy, I'm just going to call it the Pioneer stereo throughout this video. And this is an aftermarket double-din car stereo from Pioneer. And this stereo costs around £300, making it one of the more affordable branded CarPlay options. It's worth saying right at the start that if you look on Amazon for CarPlay stereos, you'll find a whole range of cheap Chinese ones. And whilst the idea of going for something that is between £60 and £120 might be tempting over saying it's £300, having just removed one of these dead units from my car, I'd say you get what you pay for. It's also worth saying if you look into the specs of these on Amazon, most of them only have 1GB of RAM and are running Android. Now, it's extremely unlikely that anyone out there has an Android phone with 1GB of RAM, so a big car stereo is not going to cope with that. If you get one of these cheap ones, you're going to find that it's slow and takes a long time to load, and probably, like the one I took out, isn't going to last very long. That means this one from Pioneer at £300, whilst much pricier, is actually one of the more affordable models from big companies like Sony and Pioneer. Of course, depending on your car, you might also need to buy cable adapters and fascias when you do buy a radio. So let's start off by talking about the design. So when it comes to design, there's not really much you can do with car stereos that hasn't been done before, because you're often limited to the space it's got to go in. This means the choice tends to be between some physical buttons and touch buttons on them, as well as a screen. The Panasonic stereo comes with touch buttons. These are along the left-hand side of the device. This makes the front of it look completely flat and super modern. It comes with an optional bezel that you may or may not need depending on your car. This can easily be removed. The back and sides are just normal metal like most car stereos and have all the appropriate screw holes. All in all, it's a smart looking car stereo. In the box, you get the stereo itself, you get a double-din mount which you may or may not need, you get removal tools for taking it out of that mount, you get some screws, you get a USB extension cable, you get a microphone, you get a standard radio cable adapter, and you get all of the usual manuals. Interestingly, you also get the manuals on a CD, which feels very old school. For most cars, you'll need to purchase an additional cable adapter depending on your stereo. So let's talk about spec. Sticking with connectivity, on the back of the device you have the power port, ports for an FM/AM aerial, a DAB aerial connector, a microphone connector, connectors for a whole variety of extra speakers and subs, a USB connector, and an aux connector. There's also ports for a wired remote. In addition to that, there's a fuse and an RGB cable input. The stereo has built-in functionality for FM and AM radio and DAB. Whether this works, it's going to depend what aerials you have in your car already, or whether you want to pick up additional things like DAB aerials you can retrofit. It also has Bluetooth built in for audio playback and making and receiving calls without using something like CarPlay. And then of course the reason you're probably going to pick one of these up is because it supports CarPlay. Now, it supports wired CarPlay only, but you can get adapters to make it work wirelessly if you want to. I personally like to charge my phone when I'm driving, and so this isn't something I've bothered with. And Apple CarPlay gives you a whole variety of apps you can use in an interface that is very familiar for iPhone users. This of course is because it is powered by your phone. It also gives you access to Siri, which is great for controlling things with your voice while you're driving. Via USB, it also supports playback of a whole variety of files. This includes things like MP3, WMA, AAC, WAV, and FLAC audio files. It does also support Android, but not Android Auto. And as an Apple user, this isn't something I've tested. In terms of power, it has a maximum power output of 50 watts by 4. And then that screen is a 6.2-inch WVGA touchscreen. This touchscreen is pretty responsive and really bright as well. So let's talk about installation. And this is going to be a really quick part of this video because it's going to largely depend on your car. For me, this was super easy as my car already had a double-din stereo in it. The previous owner had also previously purchased a fascia to adapt that. For most people, I suspect when you come to install it, it'll be a bit trickier than that, and you may want to get a professional to do it for you. But for me, when it was a simple one in, one out, it took about 15 minutes to install. When you do install it, I recommend you test it without securing it back in place first, just so you can make sure all the wires work and sound comes out. Once you know it's all working, you can then secure it in properly. Now, as the USB port is on the rear of the device and not the front, that means you're going to need to find a way to trunk that USB extension round the front of your car. Again, for me, this was nice and easy. I just tucked it down the back and came out by the leg well of the passenger seat. Now, if you look at other stereos out there, such as Sony's, some of them do have USB ports on the front of the stereo, but I personally prefer this method of having it on the back because it keeps the front nice and tidy and cable free. Equally, when you come to wiring that microphone, you might need to do some cable tucking, especially if you are to mount it to your rear view mirror. Now, I was lucky because the fascia I had a little microphone slot. I could just pop it straight in, which meant I didn't have to do any complex wiring for the microphone either. And of course, if you're not intending to use Siri or make calls with it, then you don't need to worry about that microphone anyway. And then of course, once you've got it installed, you have to do all the initial setup things such as setting the time and date on the device. Likewise, if you want to use CarPlay, the first time you plug your phone in, it will ask you for permission to connect to the CarPlay. From that point on, you just connect it and it works. So let's talk about what this stereo is like to use. And I'm going to largely focus on the CarPlay aspect because that's probably the reason you're spending £300 on a stereo. It's worth saying that the FM radio works fine, but I haven't tested DAB because that's not something I've got. So let's talk about the CarPlay and then also talk about some of the settings. So to use it with CarPlay, you simply plug in your iPhone to that wired connector. From that point on, it loads immediately. And one of the things I've noticed with this radio is actually as soon as you turn your ignition on, it does load really quickly. Likewise, that CarPlay screen loads pretty much instantly as soon as the radio has booted. This means you're probably good to go before your engine has even started. The CarPlay screen shows you a very familiar looking screen compared to your iPhone, and it shows you the apps that are available to you. If you want to reorder these, you can do that on your iPhone in Settings under General and CarPlay. You can also remove the apps you don't want to see. And with CarPlay, there are three main views. There's the app grid, an app itself, and a summary view. And the summary view typically shows you something like the music that's playing, any calendar events, and the current map setup. This gives you access to some quick controls and is a really nice view to have. Although personally, when the calendar view's on there, I do think it is a little cluttered. When you're using the stereo, that touchscreen is pretty responsive, and I've found that it works really well. Of course, there's also the built-in buttons on the stereo itself, which are those touch buttons on the left-hand side. These are used for increasing and decreasing volume, although if you want to adjust the guidance volume as well as the other volume, you can do that with the interface that appears on the bottom of the screen when you press one of these volume buttons. There's also a button that takes you out of CarPlay and also a button that summons Siri, although of course you can also say the hey phrase. Personally, I've found the built-in microphone works well for Siri and for making voice calls as well. This is great because it means you've got hands-free in your car and also keeps you safe when you're driving. Personally, I think it would have been nice if those buttons had felt a little bit different from the screen, just so you could easily reach for them without having to look at the screen. Of course, that's just personal preference. The Panasonic radio also adds its own app to the CarPlay screen. You can use this as another way to get back to the stereo's main screen. And this brings us nicely to talk about the stereo's main screen and the options, because whilst this isn't something you're going to use very often, it is certainly something worth talking about. If you go into the settings, you can do things like adjusting the time and also do things like adjusting the EQ. There's also the option to choose a theme for the stereo as well. This interface is pretty simple to use and is designed really well, although probably not something you're going to use very often if you're a CarPlay user. And of course, when it comes to design, CarPlay is the same whatever car stereo you use it on because it comes from Apple rather than the manufacturer. The only difference is that little Panasonic app I talked about earlier. CarPlay, however, is made really enjoyable to use thanks to that really responsive touchscreen. And so when it comes to CarPlay, this means you can easily access a whole variety of apps. This includes things like Apple Maps, Apple Music, and also some parking apps. You can also do things like access your audiobooks with Audible or Apple Books. And of course, it depends what apps you've got on your phone, which apps you're going to see there. If you don't use Apple Maps, Waze and Google Maps also both have their own apps for CarPlay. And then it's also worth saying if you don't use Apple Music, Spotify also has an app, along with things like TuneIn Radio. It's also worth saying that whilst this isn't something I've tried, this stereo also supports reversing cameras. So all in all, what's the verdict on this Panasonic stereo? If you're looking for a solid doubled-in stereo to upgrade your car to use Apple CarPlay, then this is one of the best options and most affordable options out there. Whilst £300 is still pretty steep, you do get what you pay for, and I personally wouldn't touch any of the £60 to £120 ones on Amazon. If you do decide you want to risk one of those, make sure you pick one up that's got at least 2 or 3 gigabytes of RAM. If you do, however, want to make sure you get a good quality one, then really do look at this Panasonic one because I've been really impressed with it. It's got a really nice interface, the touchscreen is really responsive, and it sounds great as well. If you've got any questions, do stick them below and I'll answer those questions for you. If you do want to pick one up, I've also put a link below. That link is an affiliate link, so if you use that, I do get a small percentage back from Amazon, and that helps me keep making videos for you guys. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you guys again soon.